Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinzel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinzel@gmail.com or on Twitter at sts_news. I would love to hear from you. Hey, I've got a question for you. Why do bad ideas stick around long after they've been debunked to oblivion? I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I think it's important. Take the idea that technology is changing exponentially or at an increasing rate. By no defensible measure is technology in general improving at an exponential rate. In fact, by some measures, the pace of technological change has flattened or even declined since the 1970s. Even the famous Moore's law of speedy exponential improvements in computer chips, which was never a good model for technology in general, has basically come to an end. Yet, even though people in technology studies have beat the idea of exponential technological change to death, I can almost guarantee that I will still have some student or podcast interviewer or somebody bring it up to me in the next 6 months. Or take the idea of innovation campuses, a fad at universities at the moment. No research has demonstrated that innovation campuses lead to measurable increases of innovation, economic growth, or any other significant and worthwhile public goal. But how many universities will announce new innovation campuses next year? 5? 7? It won't be 0 unless the recession that seems to be looming really sets in and kicks our asses. So really, why do bad ideas stick around? Well, we can give a range of explanations. We might try to explain it from the individual level. For instance, we might say that we are sinful creatures who go for seductive but false ideas. Or on the other extreme, we can make it an outcome of some kind of social determinism. For instance, in some readings, and some would say unfair readings of French philosopher Michel Foucault, it can seem like language, including its lousy ideas, speaks us, that we are ventriloquized by our time. I recently read a book that I thought was one of the neatest and most compelling explorations of what I'll call the zombie bad ideas question I have ever encountered. The book is University of Maryland information study professor Daniel Greene's The Promise of Access: Technology, Inequality, and the Political Economy of Hope. In some ways, Dan's book is a history and ethnography of the idea of the digital divide, the gap between the computing and internet haves and have-nots. But at a deeper level, it's a wonderful examination of how individuals and organizations become magnetically drawn to sets of ideas, even though those ideas truly, demonstrably, truly suck. I think you'll see I had a blast talking with Dan. I hope you enjoy our wild and wide-ranging conversation. Get excited. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Lee. Really happy to be here.
So, dude, The Promise of Access is a great book, and there are so many good things to say about it. How did you come to write this thing, and what were you trying to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, so this book started as my dissertation in American Studies, and I was originally, really just trying to write a pretty boring book about the digital divide, which, those words have changed. Like we've gone from digital divide to like digital inclusion,
Uh-huh.
to the STEM gap, to this demand that we should learn to code. But one of the things, especially the history chapter of the book does, is show that this is the same kind of basic social argument all the way through. And in the early 2010s, and I think this is still the case, most like digital divide research was survey based, moment in time kind
Yep.
of stuff. How many computers and how good are people at using them? And there wasn't much longitudinal or institutional work that followed people around, see how they engaged with the labor market, that kind of thing.
Huh.
So I just, very simply proposed, let's compare and contrast people on different sides of the digital
Hmm.
divide. I still bought into that language of there being like two different
Oh
economies, two
man,
different
that's so
worlds for two
interesting.
different
Yeah.
communities. And we'll see how their relationships with their devices change over time, how they gain and lose jobs. This was in the wake of the 2008 recession, so I was very interested in people trying to recover and pivot. But I was also a former social worker who mainly worked in reentry, helping people look for housing and employment after they got out of either prison or mental hospitals. And so I knew where to go,
Yeah.
and to see like two classes with different relationships to information technology hanging out. I go to the library, I go to school,
Yeah.
and places like that. And what became very obvious when talking to people just about like their stuff or about like the process of finding Wi-Fi over the course of the day is like this very basic point that like obviously librarians and patrons are not in two separate economies. Obviously, like we are not trying to send skills and tools across the ocean to a different world so that people can join us in the good life.
Hmm.
Obviously, wealth and poverty require each other. I mean, this is one of the most like kind of basic Marxist insights, right? Is
Yeah.
that wealth creates poverty. You need someone for a functioning capitalist economy. You need someone to give orders and someone to take them. These different sides are always in relationship to each other. So it was never fair to talk about people as maybe catching up to the other side because they were always connected. And further, I noticed that, like, obviously there's a million other ways to talk about poverty besides lack of skills, lack of
Yeah.
tech.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, how did this become the one way?
Mm-hmm.
And what I landed on was to focus on these institutions instead, the places like schools, like libraries, like startups that connected what we usually refer to as different sides of the labor market.
Yeah.
Because it was really in those institutions, the place that do the work of social reproduction, the places that teach us how to live under capitalism, how to seek out the labor market and survive in it. It's those places that give us these terms
Yep.
that say, like, this is what you need to do to survive. These are the good people who have the knowledge in their heads. These are the bad people who don't have it yet. I mean, that's what I do as a teacher, right? Like, we have all these like fancy pedagogy theories, but at the end of the day, what people are going into debt for is to come to me, white guy with too many degrees. I have ideas in my head. I give you those ideas, and then hopefully you get a good job. I we know it's much more complicated than that, but that's the baseline assumption
Yep.
for higher education. So instead of writing a book comparing people across the so-called digital divide, I wanted to write a book instead, eventually, about why do we think of poverty that way?
Yeah.
Why do we think that technology and skills can solve the problem of poverty? Why do we all feel that we need to learn to code or else risk starvation?
Yeah.
And eventually, the explanation that I landed on is really focused on these institutional politics. I talk about how places like schools and libraries, these institutions of social reproduction, are teaching us the rules of the game, but they're also trying to keep themselves alive.
Yeah.
because under the sort of fiscal austerity
Oh,
that has
totally.
marked out the last like 40 years
Mm-hmm.
of local governance, these are eminently local institutions, especially libraries, and the kind of political illegitimation that has come with it. Who needs a library? And we've got Wikipedia. Things mean that these places are under a lot of stress. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough political support. And all of the other institutions around them that aren't staffed by guys with guns have been cut to shreds. So every teacher is also a nurse, translator,
Yeah,
social
yeah, yeah.
worker, job coach, real estate agent, whatever.
Yeah.
And under that kind of pressure, you are desperate to get the money you need, to get the political support you
Yeah.
need, and to make your really complicated job much simpler. So this idea, what I call the access doctrine, the idea that, you get the right tools, the right skills, you will survive economic uncertainty. That idea is spoken into life by these institutions in order to keep themselves alive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They survive, they keep going, because that idea gets attention from politicians. It draws much needed grants, especially from places that do grant making right now, which is like the Gates Institution, Google Apps for Education, that kind of stuff. And they make these really complicated, stressed out jobs much simpler. So
Yeah.
I don't think any like librarian I talked to, for example, believed that, solving the homelessness crisis in DC is as simple as like making sure everyone has a laptop. No one believed that. But at the end of the day, the library was effectively the largest homeless day shelter in the city. And they did not know how to deal with the issue of, for example, like people sleeping in the library. There's
Right.
no other public space,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
no place for people to hang out. That's very complicated questions. Librarians want to create a public space. They want to care for people, but they have all these other demands. And once they start orienting their job around, this is a workplace, this is where you train, this is where you learn how to be in an office, that makes that complicated question of, are you able to sleep, much simpler.
Huh.
I just say, nope, you're not being productive, kick you out.
Mm-hmm.
So the book started as a really simple story, and became much more this thing about institutional politics and a much, frankly, bigger story about how we understand how to get to the good life
Yeah.
in the present capitalist economy.
Yeah, man. We're gonna have a lot of fun. There's like so much for us to talk about here. Before we kind of like get into some of the big stuff, I was interested about this background of you being a social worker. I worked in psychiatric hospitals for 5 years of my life. I wasn't as I would didn't have a degree, so I wasn't a social worker. I was just a lowly orderly. But anyway, I just wondered about that part of your life, and kind of like what how you got into that, and then how you transitioned to grad school into American Studies. Tell me that.
Yeah, so it's honestly like it's a pretty, not a huge philosophical shift, more along the different jobs that you get along the way.
Yeah.
So I was a psychology undergrad and was very interested in in direct service and
Yeah.
doing psych work, and not doing it with what we call the worried well, but instead with people in distress who really need help. And so I started working first as a general kind of supervising like group houses kind of situation, and then spent most of my time working in what we call a job coach role. And job coaches are this became pretty popular in the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, of community-based, supposedly evidence-based clinical social work, where you have like wraparound services that provide everything somebody needs. So like our clinic in the DC suburbs provided residential support, psychiatric support, therapy support, group activities, someone to help out with addiction. And then there was always somebody on someone's care team that helped them get back into the labor market.
Yeah.
Because, one of the really important, it was both looked on as like an important thing for socialization in Western social work. Like, you get so much identity and purpose from your job. You should be focused on getting a job,
Oh
which
yeah.
is, a
Oh
whole
yeah.
problem in and among itself. But, it was also, frankly, for certain kinds of support.
Yeah.
And this is more so in some states than others, a requirement.
Right.
Like you have to be
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
for a job in order to receive certain kinds of care.
Right.
So eventually the care teams started to have someone specifically, in that role. And, in the lead up to an immediate fallout from the 2008 recession, it, really forced a pretty serious kind of moral confrontation with the terms of that job,
Yeah.
because on the one hand, even without that specific, context of the crash, it's, I'm seeing all this hope about digital technology falling flat, where, I'm working with folks who have been institutionalized in some form or another, often for decades, and they get out, and the story that I've been told all my life is that the internet will connect them to global labor markets. Those skills will bear fruit. That's the thing that we need to do, is very much important to our clinic. And, instead, what do we see is like, you need an internet connection, a fair degree of internet literacy, to apply for jobs that themselves require no use of a computer whatsoever. Right. So, like a 3-hour electronic application to work at CVS stocking shelves.
Right.
And that's a poll tax. Like that's really just a way to limit applicants.
Yeah.
From a certain, race, class, ability. And so it just, that I couldn't explain that.
Yeah.
I couldn't explain why that was happening besides, base cruelty. And then the recession, even though it was somewhat gentler in the DC area than in other places, really forced a moral confrontation with like that whole kind of Protestant work ethic that very much drives psych care in the US, where like, why am I forcing people to look for work when right now they need to focus on their recovery?
Yeah.
Why am I? And in some places, it really was just like ticking the box of, okay, let's just try applying for 5 jobs a month. Like, we're not gonna actually go for them if they apply. We just need to do that so that we can bill it to Medicaid or whatever.
Totally.
And so I also got very interested in, why do good institutions or institutions that describe themselves as good do bad things? Because there's clearly something going on there that's not just we're confused, we have stupid ideas in our head. There's something about like the script that we've been provided that doesn't match the real world, and nonetheless that script persists.
Yeah.
So I think there is definitely another life in which I pursued my original career goal of being a therapist. But mostly like I was applying to grad school and applied to a couple different ones. I didn't want to leave the DC area because my wife was working here. And so I mostly applied to clinical and counseling programs. Then one of my letter writers that I had TA'd for as an undergrad was like, you really like doing these kind of theory and research classes. Apply to one kind of like interdisciplinary social science program. I had no idea what that meant. So I applied to the program he got his PhD from in American Studies. And then around visitation time, where I was weighing these different offers and considering my career path, like, I dealt with the very serious human tragedies that come from working in mental health and poverty, which is like, over the course of a month, 3 or 4 of my clients died. And like, it was a coincidence. And, that made me really reassess where I was going. And I frankly went for a desk job at the exact same. My wife switched career tracks and went to a much more direct service job. So now she's a nurse and I'm a teacher. And back then, like, I was a clinical social worker and she was like a nonprofit fundraiser. So we, we still have the whole package. It's just in a kind of a different setup.
I want to jump in. So I was going to leave this till later, but you've brought it up twice now in various ways. And so why not just go for it? So part of what I'm interested in is, and this is totally selfish, what I'm going to ask you now, for my own purposes, but I'm interested in how you think about like ideas that perpetuate on, even when like they're like debunked, or like
Yeah.
they almost seem to like have a force of their own at times. And the reason I'm asking you this is I'm giving a talk in like a week at a Christian study center here at Virginia Tech, and I'm looking at like Christian and secular authors who are critics of technology and saying like there's a conversation to be had here about like different backgrounds and how they bear on this issue. But the thinkers I'm looking at are like a Lowell, or we could say like Illich too. I mean, though they're different,
Yeah.
but like those kind of Catholic types. And
Hmm.
then like the Frankfurt School or something like that, instrumental reason, or we could do Heidegger. We just do something that seems more secular. And but my problem with like if we take a lull, and sorry this setup's long, but I want to get into it with you. So the problem for me is if we take like the Frankfurt School or a lull or whatever, is that it hangs at this level of generality that I find to be not helpful very often. Like they're so rarely carrying with like actual examples to like give us like concrete instances of how this plans out and how ideology works and stuff like that, right? Um, and so, but I think STS. I was thinking about your book today, and I was thinking about like Christo Sims' book,
Hmm.
the Disruptive Fixation, or Morgan Ames' book, The Charisma Machine on the One Laptop per Child. I feel like this is something people are dealing with. I don't think we have necessarily like a replacement model, or like a whole, of like it's something that we can just port into it. But like, how do you think about like the force of ideas that live on, and human lives, and agency and things like that? Which seems to be
No,
like
I mean it's
central to
not.
your question, right?
It is absolutely essential to the question. I mean, it's really the thing that drives this entire book is like, why do we stick to this script that we know doesn't work? I mean, at this point, like, hey, you should just learn to code is
Right.
a joke, but it is also something that is very seriously said. So, like
Yeah.
last summer, when Gina Raimondo, Commerce Secretary, was looking at some of like the crazy employment numbers that were coming out of the recovery from the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was like in May or something. She was talking about all those like help wanted signs that the petty bourgeois dictators were complaining about,
Yeah.
because no one was working at IHOP or whatever.
Yeah.
And she's at a press conference and she says very seriously, like, well, it appears that not enough people used the pandemic as a time to learn new skills.
Oh.
And that is like, could not be farther from the truth of the debate that we're having. Like, it
Yeah.
is like they're not dealing with a shortage of candidates. They're dealing with people who don't want to work those shit jobs.
Yeah.
Like, it is just
Yeah.
does not match the facts at all. It's just a reflex. Like, it's
Yeah.
just something you have to say because you have no other ideas.
Right.
And this is, I think this is true in the narrow sense of the issues that we're talking about here, but also like a much more general sense of like fin de siècle neoliberalism post 2008, where
Yeah.
there are no new ideas.
Yes.
There is just a zombie politics where we have nothing new.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
no one has come up with like a new model for how things work. I mean, I think there are like some things from the left, like the way that we are talking about like abolition, for example, now, or,
Yeah.
or the Green New Deal are
Yeah.
different from what has talked about before, but those are not, what's getting debated in the State House.
Right.
And I think we see that technologically too. Like, I very much take the point like that like Jason Smith or Aaron Benenev makes, where like, really, what new technology has come out in the last 12 years?
Yeah.
Like, what is like genuinely changed
Yeah. It's all
that
bullshit.
wasn't
Yeah.
present in the 21st century? So I think this is a general problem for the current political economic climate.
Yeah.
And I very much appreciate the work Morgan and Christo have done with their two excellent books that I am very much thinking about. Is like, to my eternal chagrin, that I wasn't able to talk about Christo's book more in particular. I had like a long kind of comparative note about it in the beginning of the chapter, in the beginning of the intro, that I just
Yeah. That's
because,
what happens when you write the book.
that's just how it
Yeah.
happens. But we're going to do an event together at 4S this fall that'll hopefully be work some of this stuff out.
Huh.
Because I do think my approach is genuinely different from what they are, and that like I am not trying to explain again why this is a bad idea.
Uh-huh.
I think there have been many people who are much smarter than me that have explained why learn to code doesn't solve poverty.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
Virginia Eubanks, Peter Capelli, you know, Mark Warschauer, like there's a lot of people real smart. That's fine. Keeps happening. I want to instead explain why we were addicted to this, why it survives. And I don't do so at either the level of ideas, this kind of
Yep.
reformist fixation that Christo talks about, which is correct, like anthropologically, that is exactly what's happening,
Yeah.
or this, I guess, kind of inventor mindset that Morgan is talking about, which again is anthropologically correct. It is what's happening. But rather, I think like from the empirical material in the book and from our everyday lives, like there are plenty of people who do not drink the Kool-Aid, but who nonetheless keep carrying this stuff out. And that doesn't really work with either of those models. So instead, I needed to provide a more political solution. And so, you know, in terms of your question about like how I think about this thing is in part how I think about all of my work about technology and STS, which is like and this may not be super productive for my career in the long term, I very rarely seek out tech-focused theories or tech-focused worldviews to explain technical phenomenon. I, for the most part, I think that the tech literature that we have developed to talk about this stuff is focused on the tech in itself, which is its own kind of dangerous abstraction, rather than the capitalist totality in which it sits. So there's a way that we get sucked into the hype too, is something that you're very good on, and that we end up just refuting the shitty PowerPoint instead of talking about what's actually real in the world. So I am always very much fixated on, you know, this book is a story about poverty management. It's just that technology takes a very special role in the American neoliberal imagination. If I'm talking about, like I'm working on a paper about the international labor market for the gig economy with a grad student right now, and we're not, for the most part, reading anything about Uber. We're mostly reading about like the informal labor debates of the 70s and 80s, which are just, you know, repeating again today. So I think that's the first thing, would be to consider this in the capitalist totality. Like what is the role of that particular technology or story about that technology within the larger system? And then two, I focus it on political institutions. You know, in this way, like the most important theorist for this book is not anyone who really gave a shit about technology. It's Gramsci, because what I'm interested in is this process of constructing common sense that supports hegemony. And hegemony is not, as you know, American cultural studies would usually have it, a process of propaganda. Hegemony is a process of, you know, one class coming to power through alliances with other classes and being able to substitute its needs for broader social needs. And we could think about something like the $5 a day wage 100 years ago, you know, accomplishing a similar role where, you know, people are indebted to a particular model of industrial development, even if it's one that like literally chews them up and spits them out. But it's not a trick. Like people know that job sucks. They just start to see themselves as part of a Fordist coalition because of that. And so in this book, I very much think about it as a process of like a new class of what we called Atari Democrats emerging in the 1980s to become the face of neoliberalism. New Labour accomplished something sort of similar in the UK. And they were responding to particular economic conditions, you know, the long stagnation that followed 1973. And they were responding to particular political conditions. You know, the Democrats have not held the White House for a long time, with like the, you know, minor interregnum of Carter. And they were dealing with like a, you know, a broad political dissatisfaction with what was going on. Like they're, you know, I think by the early 90s when Clinton and Gore come to power, I mean, most people had realized like, oh, we're not actually getting good jobs after we deindustrialize.
Yeah.
We are either out of work permanently or semi-permanently, going in and off the unemployment rolls, or in and out of disability, or in and out of crap jobs, or we're being sorted into service jobs that theoretically could pay more, but certainly don't,
Yeah.
and just don't have the organized labor capacity at present that industrial labor used to. So, I try to think about these ideas that stick around as things that hold together a particular political economic
Yeah.
hegemony, situation, whatever. And so then the question becomes like, what is each part of that coalition's investment in that particular set of ideas?
Yeah.
What do they get out of it? And, if their incentives change or if the coalitions change,
Yep.
how might it be different?
Yeah. This is really nice. I mean, I think this is kind of how I've come to see like innovation speak and like higher ed administrators too. I mean, there's a certain like what I like about your picture is you have this hegemonic thing going on, and you have these elites. We're gonna get into. By the way, like listeners should know that we're kind of just as a way of kind of orientation. We're kind of talking about chapter 1 in a sense right now about the discovery of the digital divide. But I think what I like is the hustle picture, right? So you have this certain elite thing going on, but then you have these institutions that are kind of like, they have their own interests. And sometimes it's just, for these folks strategically, it's helpful in all kinds of ways as you lay out for different reasons, depending on the kind of institution, to talk in this way, to kind of reinforce the idea, right? So there's kind of like hustle picture that's built into your picture of neoliberalism or something like that. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think I say this pretty often. It's like the executives really do read all those airport books.
Yeah, sure.
They really do read 10 Rules for Life or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's in part because the other people in the guest lounge, the United Club members or whatever at the airport, are also reading those books. And you need to be able to talk to those people when you need to renovate your library, to make a deal with the state house, to those kind of things. So it is the creation of a shared culture that gets used for all sorts of instrumental ends.
I love it, dude. It's so good. All right, now we're gonna talk a little bit more about the first chapter, which you've already kind of gotten into. Clinton White House, and before the Clinton White House, there's these set of actors you call the Atari Democrats. So why don't you, part of what you're talking about, as you've already outlined in this chapter, is the discovery of what we call the digital divide, right? So tell us a bit about the Atari Democrats and like how they discover digital divide, if you want to put it that way, or you can put it however you want to.
Yeah, definitely. So, and to be clear, this is a name they give themselves. Like it is like classic, like them all doing the Macarena at the 1996 DNC. Like they're always going to choose the corniest option because that's who they are. And so who are these people? All right. So mid 70s, the wheels come off the bus for, a million different reasons. You talk about the gold standard. We talk about, the end of, industrialization. We talk about like putting down anti-colonial social movements the world over. But the post-war political economic system just stops working.
Yeah.
And so there is a large amount of people who are being rendered surplus by these economic transitions. And for the resurgent right, especially the Reagan Republicans, they have a relatively easy answer to this problem, which is law and order. If there are people who don't fit, then we will lock them up and throw away the key. This is where the welfare queen discourse comes from. Where like telling New York to stick it, you can go bankrupt, comes from. And at a certain level, there's a a great deal of contradiction between this and something like Morning in America. So at the same time, the neoliberal right is also saying like there's unlimited opportunity here. Anyone who works hard in America will be able to find a place in the new economy. And that like endless opportunity would seem to contradict, okay, step out of line once you're in a cage.
Yep.
But I think there is, as always on the American right, a certain kind of like atavistic like zeal in just locking people up. Like it feels good that they don't really worry about that contradiction. And it seems to be very popular with the rest of America. So, 2 straight landslides for Reagan, wipe out the New Deal Democratic coalition. In response, the Democrats need to figure out something else to do. And they come to represent a different class coalition, or at least shed the other parts of that class coalition that had carried them through the New Deal era. And so they do 2 things. They recruit a new set of donors, new set of money at the top. This is people with a global political outlook, people who are very interested in high technology and so need some sort of federal support for R&D, people who want to make global trade deals happen to ensure that English remains the language of commerce, to ensure that we, maintain our kind of export economy that is, competing and struggling against Japan and Germany. So it's a lot of people from Goldman or MCI or HP or Apple, like John Scully. Like these are the people who are recruited to the new Democratic Leadership Council, along with folks like Gephardt, Gore, these kinds of folks. And at the same time, they're also very much changing the base of the party. The people who are most active in the Democratic Party, the people that the party is most trying to recruit, either to run or to vote. And those folks look very different from the New Deal coalition. These are white people like me. They're highly educated. They're usually working in office parks, often in the suburbs, Route 128 in Massachusetts, Montgomery County, Maryland, Silicon Valley. They rise through the ranks in their job, not through any kind of like trade association or a union, but through their education and credentials.
And you call them the creative class. That's what you call them, right?
Yes, I'm very invested in the creative class. But yeah, I mean, like, I think there is, in part what I'm trying to do here is to like say that there is like a sociological basis for like this new political coalition. It's just that we often get like the causal direction wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So those people are coming around and they, are very against certain aspects of the Republican agenda. For example, like very, very invested in equality of opportunity.
Yeah.
But, if you scratch a little bit and see that these folks are also very against any kind of formal redistributive measures, especially the things that would touch them. So new affordable housing, great. New affordable housing in my neighborhood, not so much. More funding for schools, great. 2-way busing to integrate our system schools, oh, heaven forfend.
Right.
Like that's, and I think there have been a lot of great recent historians, especially Lily Geismer, who's written really well on the politics of this particular white cohort that ends up taking over the Democratic Party. And they come back to power and begin this long 1990s that we may not have yet exited, because they resolve that contradiction in the Republican story about America, that contradiction between unlimited opportunity on the one hand and exacting punishment on the other. And they do so by commercializing the internet. So the voter base and the donor base are both much more invested in the internet in the 1980s than most Americans are, because most Americans can't see it or touch it. And Al Gore had long wanted to privatize the internet, finally gets his shot in the 90s. And the pitch that the Democrats give is this thing will connect everybody to the global labor market. Wherever this thing touches, you will have the opportunity for a good job.
Yep.
And so that makes the privatization of the internet an anti-poverty measure. And that means that we
Yep.
always have to make sure that we remember that technology policy and poverty policy are happening together. Because the exact same time that the Clintons are saying, well, these people who are left out of the internet, those people are a drag on national productivity. They
Yeah.
need to get online. If they refuse to get online, that's a sign that they're not particularly productive. And so then we can turn to the more carceral wing of the state.
Yeah. Yeah.
At
Yeah.
the same time that is happening, and these discovering the divide reports from falling through the net in the NTIA, as well as like the whole kind of NGO world that births. At the same time that is happening in the mid 90s, we are also ending welfare as we know it.
Yeah.
We are
Totally.
also deregulating all telecommunications markets to give us really expensive, slow internet in the US. We are also on a prison building boom. These things are happening at the exact same time with the exact same people. And that hegemony is held together by this class, these
Yeah.
Atari Democrats who really do think that expanding this world will lock everyone into a very particular kind of labor market that suits our very particular needs, but maybe not everybody else's.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, I'm reading the internet policy as part and parcel of the success of neoliberal hegemony, which really needed Clinton to happen. You don't get that hegemony just with Reagan,
Yeah.
because half the country is fighting against it. It really takes Clinton to cement that as common sense for everybody.
Can you help me understand something that's, I mean, it's part of what you just said, but it's also even more background than the way you just put it, which is that I've been trying to understand recently how the good old Dems got so wedded to education as the solution to policy or economic problems, basically. And um, and part of it is in your moment, but I also see it a bit before. So my example would be I've been following Robert Reich, the
Mm-hmm.
and in the early '80s he's doing kind of like um industrial policy stuff, right? Because it's about the worries of the '70s and melting deindustrialization, all that kind of stuff. Education's already in there a little bit, but by the mid '80s, even before the internet really comes online and that becomes his focus, which it does become his focus, already the education for him and I think for others is like the answer to all these economic problems, like including inequality. And part of the so if even if I want to play out kind of like neoclassical whatever economics, I can play like mainstream economics and look like if you improve human capital, you will have more startups. You'll have more entrepreneurial activity. You'll have more innovation. You'll have more change. That'll create more jobs. So eventually, you'll have bounty, right? But how much are you real? It's not
Sure.
that, right? And so, like, the question is like, where is their vision of like creating jobs? Because it's like you could. This is what happens, right? We encourage people to go to college by the 2000s, definitely by the 2010s. The wages of college grads are stagnating because we're overproducing grads for jobs that are like don't fucking exist, right? And so I don't know. Just how do you understand that? Because it's like in your book, but I also just wanted to just ask you about it. You know?
Yeah, I hear you. And I think there may be some, I mean, there may be different social mechanisms for like the
Yeah.
elites as opposed to like the rest of us. But yeah, I mean, that, we could say that like this naive empiricist belief in the power of education is, you could maybe say like, okay, give them a good faith read in the 80s and 90s. But by the time 2009 rolls around, like the wage premium for education has fallen through the roof. It's
Yeah.
fallen through the floor. It's very clear that this is not the kind of thing that's going to make, especially racial and economic inequality
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
And but we're still addicted to it.
Yeah.
Part of the way that I explain that, especially at the level of the helping professions, like the
Mm-hmm.
people providing direct services, like teachers and
Yeah.
librarians, is that those the people doing the help are trying to make the people getting the help look more like them. Like that's how our
Mm.
institutions function right now.
Uh huh. Uh
And
huh.
there is a certain racial and class bias to that process
Yeah.
where you know, it seems to have worked for me.
Yeah.
I went to school, I got a degree, I got a good job. So maybe that's replicable.
Yeah.
And even if, as a nice white person, I know in the abstract that, well, a lot of it's down to dumb luck
Uh-huh.
or the wealth inherited from segregated housing markets,
Or just
or
inheritance in
whatever,
general. Yeah, totally.
or
Like
just inheritance in
capital
general.
just
Yeah,
getting happened handed down. Yeah.
sure. And all that is happening,
Yeah.
but our jobs, especially the helping professions, make us tell that story
Yep.
because like we are supposed to provide the next generation of students, library patrons, whatever, with the opportunity that they need to survive. So I
Yep.
need to sell them on my biography. My biography is mobilized by the institution in which I work. So I think there, especially at that level, there is a real investment in that story
Yeah.
of meritocracy. I call it a meritocratic mindset that is like deep in our helping institutions. In general, I think the propaganda is thicker the further you are away from the floor. So
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
leaders of a variety
Yeah.
of stripes are always going to be further away from the reality and are going to be more invested in these
Yeah.
more
You
simple
see it in like
stories.
the World Economic Forum. They're really
Yeah,
bought into this shit too. So like,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So and then at that level, I think there's a couple of other things going on. One of them being that like the thing that has plagued every part of Western society since World War One. We killed God, and we don't know exactly what to replace him with.
Hallelujah,
And
Dan.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I think for especially for professional whites,
Yeah.
the one of the few remaining sources of moral legitimacy is education.
Totally.
Um, and it's not even really like actually doing education, it's the aesthetics of education,
Totally.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
about like having those books and the letters in the
Yeah.
background. I think Tressie Cottom's book on for-profit education is really good on this because like
Huh.
she's talking about people who are very invested in getting an incredibly abusive degree that will likely sentence
Right.
them to extraordinary debt for the rest of their lives. And she's meeting like person after person who is saying like, yeah, obviously this sucks. I know that taking on $100,000 in debt is stupid, but if I'm taking $100,000 in debt on, that means it has to be legitimate. That means those letters have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
mean
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that calculus of moral legitimacy is then imposed on everybody else because what else do we got?
Yeah.
Where else are you supposed to go?
So I think we could talk all fucking day long about all kinds of stuff. We could just keep going on and on. But I do want to give listeners like a little picture of your book. So in the first chapter, you do a really good job of kind of spelling out this ideology, or however we want to think of the digital divide and these other concepts, and then the role of these elites, and you spell out this ideology really, really, really wonderfully, or hegemony, however we want to think about it. And then in the next three chapters, you give us kind of ethnographies of three different institutions, right? So we have a startup, we have a public library, and we have a charter school. So which we can think it's a private organization technically, but also plays a kind of semi-public role, right? So why don't we first start with the startup and like what does it show us about the picture you wanna draw out?
Yeah, so I mean, this is another place where the project transformed over time. So what had seemed like a place where I wanted to see how the other half lives
Mm-hmm.
became, as I was writing the book, much more of a story about an ideal type organization. Because if there is one kind of organizational form that all of our offices and cultural institutions and governments have been forced to like remake themselves on the basis of, it's startup life.
Mm-hmm.
Like and that juice is I think starting to run out.
Yes, I think so too.
More so than it was even 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But especially in the moment of the book, which largely takes place from 2011 to 2015, this is still very much dominant, and I think it was incredibly important in the wake of the 2008-2009 recession, because it was part of the recovery engine for cities that were very much devastated and needed people to take up real estate, and needed like some kind of stick to poke their government public institutions with. So I'm interested in this startup that I call InCrowd as an example of doing it right, according to this political common sense about the access doctrine. These are the people that seem to have it right. These are the organizations that seem to be able to keep themselves alive. And then that rubric is then imposed on other people.
Yeah.
So I needed to figure out what the ideal type looked like first. And so I spend, the chapter moves back and forth between these more general experiences of the DC tech community, which is, pretty similar to a lot of other startup scenes outside of New York and San Francisco that are, trying to grow themselves in part on this Richard Florida model of like, if you build more bike paths and coffee shops, then wealthy people will come here. Yoga studios, exactly. And so what I'm interested in is how that becomes common sense, and especially how it works at different scales. So that chapter gets bigger as it goes, and I'm really trying to explain how this startup mindset, this belief in social mobility through technology, works for individuals, for organizations, and for a city as a whole. And the thing that I land on is this orientation that's really, really important to tech and that they take very seriously, which is the thinking about the pivot.
Yes. Talk about the pivot, Dan.
So this, this word has been in circulation in a lot of different places, but becomes mostly out of this book by Eric Ries, called The Lean Startup, which comes out in, I want to say 2010, and was very hot when I was doing my field work. And the Lean Startup is about taking some nominal lessons from lean production, Toyotaism, having just an absolute minimum of inventory, and doing like constant reassessment of your production methods and of your supply chains to be able to like run as close to zero as possible. And instead applying that not just to manufacturing or the labor process, but like to the entire culture of the firm, identity of the firm, setup of the firm. So their proposition is like every startup will have at some point a couple of pivotable moments, these real gut check moments where the data is coming in and your current approach looks wrong.
Right. And
the way you tell a startup from another business is not the kind of products it produces, but its ability to adapt to radical change. So a startup has to be able to pivot, has to be able to look at the incoming data and say, like, we need to be something completely different. And then to change themselves around that. And so the company that I spent the most time at InCrowd was a business to consumer company at the beginning of its life. That wasn't really working out. And the way they went towards success and a fairly significant wealth was to become a business to business company. They basically made catering software and found obviously that it's much more profitable to help like hotels cater than it is to help individuals. And that identity then, which that pitch that they were making to investors then filtered down into who they hired, the setup of their office, the software itself, their entire outlook. And that is something that Rice argues, I think correctly, is like the identifying mark of startup. If startup means one thing, it is this heroic ideal where you can not just like survive economic change and economic uncertainty, but like kind of master it and then surf the wave. And there are a lot of reasons why startups can do that, but other folks can't. A startup by its nature does not have a lot of fixed capital investment. There's no plant. So you don't have to like reshuffle stuff around that much.
Yes, of course.
It's a fairly small organization that can hire and rehire. They often have like no revenue, but a ton of investment. So like they have like the funds, what they call the runway, that is able to like readjust this kind of stuff. And so I was really interested in seeing how that played out throughout the organization, and then for the city at large, because the pitch that the city made to startups, and that the startups in turn made to the city, was that we will help the city pivot. What you see us doing, we will help you do. If you basically, if you give us tax write-offs, then we will replace the human capital stock of your city. We will replace the unproductive Black and brown service workers with white hipsters who are doing this kind of thing, and then we will slowly take over the rest of your cultural institutions to make them more dynamic, entrepreneurial, and innovative. And that at the end of the day, like, it's really just an excuse for gentrification that like it allows us to imagine that tax handouts to real estate developers
or universities
or coffee shops are an investment in productive capacity. Because at the end of the day, startups don't really need plant. They need a space to type. And
pizzas.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, that at the end of the day, this is kind of putting a hopeful, optimistic, productive gloss on something that was going to happen anyway, which is that, in the wake of a recession, capital is going to try to raise the rent gap on devalued assets and bring in a different kind of people. And what the thread that carries through the rest of the book, as I trace how that idea then moves between different institutions, often with the same people or the same technologies. One of the advantages of doing an ethnography in one city is to see how people and money and devices moved from startup land to libraries to schools, stuff like that. Is we start to see that like the rest of the city gets enrolled in this project, but it doesn't fit in the same way. Like a school can't be a startup. A library can't be a startup.
Oh, but they can pivot.
But they can try. They can try. And not just they can try, they have to try.
Right.
Like their future is predicated on the attempt to be a startup, even as everyone knows the entire time that, well, we're a library. We have to take in everyone who comes through the door.
Right.
We cannot suddenly decide to be something else. We're a charter school, and we'll talk about specifically about the politics of charter schools. But like even then, these like privately managed public institutions are not going to change based on like the grades that come in the middle of a year. Like they're going to try. That chapter is a lot about that try. But at the end of the day, they can't like. The school focused on learning to code will not suddenly become a Chinese language immersion program in the middle of the year. Based on the quarterly revenue projections.
Dude,
whereas in startup land, that's normal.
There's this hilarious video I used in my innovation and context class before. And it was a video of our university president talking about Virginia Tech, right? And he's a guy, he just uses a lot of like hip terms like that are cool with that class. And but he doesn't really think about what they mean. And it's so awkward because he's actually quite a bad speaker. And so he pauses in the middle of his talk and he says something like, and doing this has made us more looks down at his iPad, agile. And he's like, he's talking about like this giant state bureaucracy. Right. It's not a fucking startup, bro. It's not, and we're not making software. We have heavy capital and blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's so many disanalogies, right? And yet, and at the same time, universities have to try, just like you're saying. I mean, there could be a university chapter because they have to play the same game in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, the book is intensely autobiographical. Like what's the story of like digital humanities, for example? I mean, there's obviously lots of like really interesting research that's come out of that field, but for the most part, this is like a survival strategy.
Totally, I agree with you. Yes. Um, let's talk about so I feel like we've said a bit about the library, and mostly I want people to go read your very good book, so I don't want to give them everything. Why don't we talk about the politics of charter schools for a couple minutes before we kind of like bring things together at the end? So go for it.
Sure. So charters are, in setting up the book in this kind of comparative process where I look at these different institutions and see how people and money and ideas flow between them, is really about seeing how well that idea of the pivot, this idea of the access doctrine, fits these places.
Yeah.
It doesn't. But nonetheless, they have to keep trying. So
Right.
eventually, in the public institutions and libraries and schools, I talk about this process of bootstrapping, where
Yeah.
this intense organizational restructuring happens over and over again, precisely because you can't meet the goals that you've been politically assigned to meet.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, school cannot be responsible for poverty reduction for all the reasons that we've talked about. Nonetheless, we are going to make them responsible for it because we've killed all of the other institutions that do so,
Yeah.
and because we don't want to directly create jobs or give people money.
Yep.
So the schools fall into this role, and we punish them when they don't live up to it. And that leads to this constant process of organizational restructuring is normal for startups, but just does not fit what a school or a library does. And I think, public libraries have been many different things in American history,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
charter schools are native to this moment.
Yes.
Our charter schools, again, like there have been something like charters for a lot of American history. We think about like Montessori schools, but as like
Yeah.
the privately managed public assets that are intended as a poverty reduction measure are intended
Yep.
as an entrepreneurial market where like the best model wins out, measured in test scores. Like that thing is really native to the 90s and 2000s. So we can think about, as I'm doing field work at the end of Michelle Rhee's reign in DCPS, this is our, who was the schools chancellor here. And she is pictured on the cover of Time magazine with a big broom, cleaning up American public schools. She then becomes a star of the Waiting for Superman charter propaganda documentary that Obama airs at the White House with a bunch of the kids who were starred there. That's happening in DC, and there's I think fairly be fair to say a revolt against that Mayor Fenty and that Chancellor Rhee, because they were closing schools left and right. They were firing teachers left and right, largely based on these phony evaluation measures that were tying teachers' pay and promotion to student test scores. Voters got really fed up with that, in large part because, not just like closing schools is obviously a threat that everyone feels, but DC did not have a comprehensive public university until the 80s when UGC was formed. So really the only route to the professional class was through a teaching degree.
Mm-hmm.
And Black DC very much perceived the closure of schools and the attack on teachers' unions as a threat against the Black middle class. Voted these people out.
Yeah.
So those dynamics are very specific to the present moment. And I wanted to really zoom in on, just like the startup, a school that like represented the best possible instance of these trends, where people were giving it a good faith effort, were really trying to help, and we're not engaging in any of like the financial chicanery or like TED Talk BS that like so dominates the sector. So it was very important to me to look at like what I felt was a good business, good library, good school, to really look at these things in their best possible case. And I would feel comfortable sending my daughter to the school that I called Du Bois in the book. Like it's a good school. It doesn't exist in the same form as it did when I studied it, but it was a nice place where people really were trying. And what happens there is that the thing that people were recruited to try really hard on, this like racial justice mission, butts up against the political mission of the school, which is
Mm-hmm.
raise test scores, get kids into college, save them from the underclass.
Yep.
It's intensely racialized with a largely white teachers dealing with largely Black and Latino students. Uh, and what happens over time is that they are really forced to give up this racial justice, accepting of everyone mission, and become a much more competitive,
Yep.
disciplinary, professionalized space because their regulators, their donors, and their school board need to see year over year improvement in test scores. They need to see
Yep.
the numbers go up,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they
Yep.
need to see that the use of information technology, primarily these laptops that every kid was given, are part of that story.
Yep.
And that causes everybody a lot of stress.
Yeah.
Teachers
Oh yeah.
teachers start quitting, teachers start collapsing, students really freak out that, like, hey, I don't really want to go to college, there's not really room for me here. And the whole thing, as we get towards the first senior class that I was spent a year with, the whole thing really starts to feel like the school has changed. Like, it is not the school that everyone signed up to either go to work in
Mm-hmm.
or to attend. Like, they
Yeah.
pivoted, they did it, and they ended up leaving a lot of people behind.
It's fascinating, man. It's. I mean, I can hear your autobiographical story about how these institutions stitch together. But still, one of the things I really like about your book is how you let each institution be each institution. I mean, this is a kind of methodological thing you do, and you try to understand the space they're working in. And yet, like this, in some sense, like a master logic still plays out, but it has like these nuances depending on what your industry is, what the history is there, what the background is. And so yeah, I mean, just hats off to you. I think it's a cool part of the book that you really go all the way on it.
I appreciate that. It really was a goal to try to, to be a good Marxist and pursue like an immanent critique.
Yeah.
Like, it is very important to me that I address these places on their own terms and follow those logics on their own terms,
Yeah.
rather than critiquing it from the outside, which is important. Like, we need
Yeah.
normative and political alternatives to whatever the dominant
Yeah.
vision is. But to really understand what that dominant vision is, how it works, where it came from, is we have to not believe in it, but like follow it to its logical conclusion. So it was really
Sure.
important for me to understand these folks on their terms. And then, that's built into the ethnographic process in a way. Like, I always had people like looking at my drafts who are, I was
Yep.
in the field with, that kind of thing.
Right on, man. So I mean, one way I wanted to ask you about why it's the politics of hope, but I also thought you could just put some cards on the table and say, like, when you think about better roads forward. I'm not going to ask you what gives you hope, Dan, because I don't know if that's even an appropriate question. But like, like what when you think about better roads forwards on these issue, like what do we need to do, man? How do we cut out the bullshit and like start getting real about what we're facing here?
Yeah, where people start being real. I'm actually pretty comfortable talking about with the what is to be done question, in part because I like the book, I believe in it, and I think I'm right. And
Yeah.
the so why hope in the present? So the subtitle of the book has this political economy of hope, and in part that's because these institutions of social reproduction are hinged to, or have their compass oriented to, future labor markets,
Yeah.
and that our current work will bring success in that economic future. So they're always tied towards that future orientation. Interpersonally, the way that is represented in kind of like the everyday work of going to school or going to the library are these intensely vertical relationships between the helping professional and the person there to be helped, between the librarian and the patron, between the student and the teacher. Even as like obviously there are many other things that go on in these very diverse institutions. The script that we're taught to read is very much, I have the stuff and the knowledge. I will give you the stuff and the knowledge, and then you will survive. That may not work, but that is the script that we are supposed to read.
Yep.
That means that these places are intensely individualizing. We've really cut across any kind of like possible community fabric in these places. And that means that when push comes to shove and either party, the helper or the helped, wants to resist the things that are happening in these institutions, they often fall short individually because they just don't have the juice to take it that far. So the one of the big examples I give in the book as I open the concluding chapter is in 2017, Martin Luther King Library, the central branch that I followed around for chapter 3, is finally closing and getting a long overdue renovation. But in so doing, they close what is effectively the largest homeless day shelter in the city. Hundreds of people dropped off every day or on the walk over because it's a central location. You're generally not allowed to stay in homeless shelters during the day. And, there's no public space in the city. Like where are you supposed to go if you don't buy anything? The library is really it. And no one was happy with the closure. Librarians' jobs had suffered because they had been oriented towards this more, training orientation for knowledge work. They had been charged with doing much more policing for like kicking out people who weren't being productive. Patrons were upset about getting kicked out of the library because they had nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
But they couldn't do anything about it. These two sides were split up. There was like a meager protest of like maybe 24 people at the closure, but the city just kind of rolled right over them.
Mm-hmm.
In contrast, we could think about something like the wave of teacher strikes that took over the country in 2018, and that we saw to a lesser extent in 2020 in support of the movement for Black Lives. And a lot of these things have their roots in the Chicago Teachers Union, and the Radical Core Caucus took over in 2010. And what you see in those places is, something that I've said in union organizing for education, which is like, my working conditions are students' learning conditions.
Yeah.
I need them, they need me. The degradation of my job degrades their public space. The degradation of their public space degrades my job. I have a strategic position in the labor process or in the mode of production, whereas like, if I don't show up to teach, nothing gets taught. They have greater numbers, there's more of them, and they have political legitimacy that I don't have. Like when teachers strike, the first thing everyone says is, oh, they're hurt, greedy unions are hurting the kids. But if we follow like what CORE did in Chicago and continues to do, and we're organizing with our students, with their parents, with other workers in the neighborhood, we're all in it together because we all really do need the school, because the school is, in reality, not just a place where you get computer. Schools where you get food, where you get friends, where you get translation services, where you get care, where you play basketball. It's everything. And we all deserve that. We all deserve all the parts of the good life. And those political relationships where we march together, where like LAUSD teachers are striking in part because their students are being constantly frisked every day. Chicago teachers are striking because they want to divert some of the city's real estate development fund into schools, where they don't have working air conditioning. That is not a vertical relationship. That is not me saying like, the only way you're going to survive is by being like me. That is instead saying like, we're different. We're not the same. Our fights are not the same, but our fights are intersecting at the same place in this building. Mm-hmm. That's a horizontal relationship because I need you and you need me. That is very different from what the access doctrine is teaching, that there's only like, that you have this slim life raft to be able to survive. Instead, it's saying like, we need to fight together. It's not about the future. It's about the present. It's a very day-to-day thing. So that really is my pitch for how we get over this. Like, I think like there's a lot of other things going on in other kind of like strategic sectors of the economy, like, logistics or whatever. But I do sincerely believe that our Soviets will be in these centers for social reproduction, in healthcare, in education, in public libraries, these things that
Mm-hmm.
everyone needs and knows, and that we can use these places. We're already powerful there. We're more powerful than we think. And we can use them as as a staging ground for a broader fight for liberation because they connect into other sectors of the community. And I, if you had told me in 2008 that we would have seen teacher strikes in Oklahoma and West Virginia and Arizona at the same time, I would have asked what you were smoking. Like,
Yeah, totally.
I cannot imagine that.
Yeah.
And now that's just it's just a fact. Like, that happened. We know it can happen, so we can do it again, and we can do it harder.
Yep.
And that's my pitch, is to throw away that kind of like cruel optimism of like, maybe you can survive in the future if you learn to code, and to focus much more on the present of like, I need a space to nap during the day. I wish I could do that in the library, but they kick me out. Let me talk to the librarian about that, and we'll see how we can figure it out together.
Yeah, man. I like it a lot. I totally agree with you. I won't even get into how different this is, what you're saying is, than so much shit that gets talked about in STS. That's a whole nother podcast we can do. But why don't you give the people like some sense of where you're heading next?
Sure. So, if there's one question about the book in that runs through the book in like very Marxist terms, it's like, what is a socially necessary worker? What is, if socially necessary labor time is what produces the value of any given commodity, then there is one commodity above all others, which is labor power. How do we define socially necessary labor power? And that's in part what these institutions of social reproduction are doing. They are producing people fit for the current mode of production. That doesn't mean that it works. That doesn't mean that it wins. It just means that's how the glue is being held together right now. And so in future work, the next book is going to be largely oriented around that question at the level of the firm, and saying like, okay, how do firms decide who belongs, who to hire or who to kick out? How do you measure people and decide whether they fit in the organization, whether they're performing well, and whether to get rid of them? Because, especially in places like academe, whenever we want to get rid of somebody or justify not including them, it's always this language about fit. Yeah. And fit is not necessarily productivity. It's culture, it's attitude, it's skills, it's all this other thing. And eventually, especially for large distributed organizations, you need to establish some kind of rubric for that. And that's all that like a personality test is, or an online job application, or an H-1B visa. These are all different instruments we use to kind of standardize fit across broad organizations. So I want to write a big but kind of episodic book about the different artifacts that we use to standardize fit. Things like visa programs, things like online job applications, things like we were talking about before we started recording, like the GS system and the feds. And so that's where I'll be for the next couple years. And then, it's been time to start doing fun stuff that's not the book, which is one of the great joys of living in a more kind of collaborative work environment in high school. So like, I'm working with a colleague in education about student athletes' personal data, what kind of how it's collected, what they learn from it or not. So like take like guys in the football team are all amateur data scientists. They're super smart. They're constantly doing fairly complicated statistics in their head. No one talks about them as people with that level of expertise. Rarely are they allowed to even see the other side of the clipboard. So I'm really interested in how that data is used organizationally in a very weird type of workplace. And that's another project that's been really fun that we're going to be continuing on for the next couple of years.
That's cool, dude. I love that one too. Good work, Dan. Everyone should check out your book, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, dude.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much, Lee.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinzel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Ford is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.